approved the order. I want every species listening to this testimony to hear that before anything else is said. The abduction of 206 human children from a frontier colony called Ariden 4 was my recommendation, my operational design, and my command. I told the Telvari Dominion High Council that it would bring Earth to the negotiating table within a single standard cycle. I told them the humans would fold under emotional pressure the way they always folded when something they loved was at stake. I told them the operation was low risk, high reward, and surgically clean. I used those exact words in my briefing. Low risk. I remember saying them with confidence, the way a man remembers the last thing he said before the floor dropped out from under his feet. My name is Valith Sareen. I held the rank of commander in the Telvari 3rd Fleet. I had spent 15 cycles studying humanity, not casually, not as a secondary interest between deployments. 15 cycles of dedicated obsessive study. I had read their literature, their holy books, their war histories, their courtroom transcripts, and their bedtime stories. I had mapped their colonial trade networks across 47 worlds. I had cataloged every diplomatic exchange between Earth and other conquered species going back a full century. I had memorized the published rules of engagement for every branch of their military. I had built predictive behavioral models that were adopted as standard reference across 3 fleet commands. My work had earned formal commendations from 2 successive Dominion chancellors. I was invited to lecture at the War Academy on human threat assessment. Foreign intelligence agencies consulted me when they needed to predict how Earth would respond to a given provocation. I was the foremost authority on human behavior in all of Telvari space. Every model I built was wrong. Not wrong at the edges, wrong at the root. And this testimony is my attempt to explain what I missed so that no other species in this conquered ever makes the same catastrophic error. The Dominion needed leverage against Earth. Their colonial expansion was accelerating beyond anything our analysts could model. 47 permanent settlements in 15 cycles, with new colony ships launching every few months. Their trade routes were threading through neutral space like roots through soft ground, connecting species and markets that had never dealt with each other, always with human intermediaries at the center of the exchange. They were making themselves essential to the galactic economy, and that economic centrality was becoming political influence that grew heavier every year. Sanctions accomplished nothing. 3 rounds of conquered-mediated negotiations had produced agreements Earth honored perfectly while continuing to expand faster than ever. My government wanted Earth brought to its knees without triggering a formal war. They gave the problem to me. I gave them Ariden 4. A frontier agricultural world at the outer edge of mapped space. Population under 12,000. Settlers, agronomists, researchers, and their families growing engineered grain in wide golden fields and building a quiet life far from the noise of the inner colonies. I had studied the colony in detail for months. I knew its settlement layout, the shift schedules at the agricultural center, the patrol patterns of its tiny civilian security force. 3 retired military officers with sidearms they carried out of habit rather than necessity. No garrison, no orbital defenses, no strategic value whatsoever beyond a single critical fact. It had a school district with 206 children between the ages of 4 and 14. My behavioral models showed that humans were more emotionally reactive about their offspring than any species in the conquered. Their entire civilization bent around the protection of children like light around a gravity well. Laws, social structures, cultural narratives, everything pointed to the same conclusion. Children were the one thing humans would surrender anything to protect. Take the children, hold them safely in a secure facility, issue demands, and wait. They would negotiate because that was what humans always did. They would accept our terms because the alternative was unthinkable. They would get their children back. We would get our concessions, clean and bloodless. I prepared 17 response scenarios with counter-strategies for each. The scenario that actually happened was not among them. Not because I lacked imagination, but because what humans did fell outside the boundaries of any behavior I believed a species was capable of. The operation launched on the 12th day of the human spring cycle. 30 commando units in light insertion craft, full sedation protocols. I watched the feeds from orbit aboard my flagship, tracking each team's progress with the focused attention of a man watching his masterwork take shape. Midday insertion, while the adult population gathered at a community festival 3 kilometers from the school district. Our teams moved through the grounds with clinical precision. Sedation darts fired from concealed positions. Children collapsed mid-step, mid-word, mid-laugh, folding gently onto the grass as the compounds took hold. Some of them were holding things when they fell. A ball, a sandwich, a friend's hand. Transfer to 4 transports was careful and methodical. No rough handling, no injuries. I had been explicit about that in the operational briefing. Damaged goods weaken a negotiating position. 40 minutes. From first boots on the ground to the last transport clearing atmosphere, the entire operation took 40 minutes. 206 children lifted off a world that did not even know they were missing until the engine trails faded from the afternoon sky. By the time the first parent came running from the festival, we were already in faster-than-light transit. I watched the operational summary with quiet satisfaction. Clean work, textbook precision, the kind of operation I would one day teach at the academy. Then I pulled up the ground-level camera feeds from the colony, and something I did not expect was waiting for me on the screen. The adults had reached the empty play areas, hundreds of them pouring out of the festival grounds at a run, spreading across the school district in a panicked wave. They found what we had left behind, scattered toys lying in the grass where small hands had dropped them, half-eaten lunches on blankets, drawings pinned to outdoor boards with bright colors still drying in the sun, and shoes. Dozens and dozens of tiny shoes standing upright on the ground where sedation darts had dropped their owners in mid-stride. Little shoes with bright colors and cartoon animals and scuffed toes and laces still tied in the clumsy knots that small fingers produce, standing perfectly upright in the grass as if their owners had simply evaporated and left their footprints behind. I expected chaos, the kind of screaming, frantic disorder that panicked populations always produce. That was not what happened. The screaming lasted less than a minute. It rose and then it stopped, all at once, as if someone had reached inside the crowd and turned a switch. What replaced it was something I had never seen in any species under any circumstances. A silence. Not the silence of shock. Not the silence of people who cannot process what has happened. A deliberate silence. A chosen silence. The silence of a group of people who have all understood the same thing at the same moment, and have all, independently, arrived at the same conclusion about what needs to happen next. A woman was standing in the center of the largest play area, blonde hair pulled back, dirt on her knees where she had dropped to the ground when she first arrived. She had picked up a single shoe from the grass, a child's shoe bright red with small white stars on the sides. She held it against her chest with both hands and looked up at the sky where the transports had vanished. Her face was calm, not blank, not numb, calm. Calm the way deep water is calm when something enormous is moving beneath the surface. Around her, other parents were standing in the same way, holding small objects. A toy, a hair ribbon, a juice container still marked with fingerprints too small to belong to anyone old enough to reach a kitchen counter. All of them looking upward with that same expression. That same terrible, steady, burning calm. I should have recognized what I was seeing. I should have understood that a species which goes quiet instead of loud when its children are taken is a species that has skipped past grief and landed directly on something far more dangerous. I did not understand it. I noted it as an anomaly in my operational log and moved on. We broadcast our demands 6 hours after extraction. Standard package. Territorial concessions in 3 contested star systems. Full trade access through the strategic corridor. Withdrawal of human military assets from the border zone. Reasonable terms. Proportionate to the leverage. The kind of deal any rational government accepts to recover 200 children unharmed. I expected a response in 3 to 5 days. Diplomatic crisis timelines were well documented. First, internal deliberation. Then, back-channel communications. Then, a formal counteroffer. I had prepared compromise positions for every stage. The response came in 6 hours. It did not come through diplomatic channels. It came on every open frequency in known space at the same time. Every channel, every band, every wavelength that could carry a human voice, all at once, as if the entire species had drawn a single breath and used it to speak 2 words. Return them. No conditions, no counteroffer, no deadline, no or else. Just 2 words in a voice so flat and so controlled it could have been reading a serial number off a cargo manifest. Return them. My communications officer turned to look at me. I could see the uncertainty forming behind his eyes. I waved it away. Posturing, I told him. Emotional rhetoric for their domestic audience. Standard psychological response to a hostage crisis. They are projecting strength while their diplomats assemble a real response behind the scenes. We hold firm. They will come to the table. I filed my report to Dominion High Command. Operation successful. Demands delivered. Human response, predictable emotional posturing, no substantive content. Recommendation, maintain position and await formal diplomatic contact. I went to my quarters. I reviewed my operational notes one final time. I graded my own performance the way an instructor grades an examination. High marks. I set the tablet aside, turned off the light, and closed my eyes. I slept well. I want every delegate in this chamber to sit with that. The officer who stole 206 children from their families slept peacefully because he believed with total certainty that he understood the species he had just provoked. Not once in 15 cycles of study had I considered the possibility that humans might respond to the loss of their children with something other than negotiation, military force, or some combination of the two. Not once had I imagined that they might respond with something my models had no category for, something my instruments could not detect, something that had no name in any Telvari language because my species had simply never experienced it at the intensity humans carry it, as naturally and as constantly as they carry blood in their veins. I understood nothing, and what was already assembling itself across the width of the galaxy while I slept in my comfortable quarters was not a military response, and it was not a diplomatic response, and it was not anything that any officer in the history of the Telvari Dominion had ever been trained to recognize or prepared to survive. I woke to a kind of silence I had never experienced aboard a military vessel, not the quiet of a ship at rest between watch rotations, a different kind of silence, the heavy, held-breath silence of a crew that has learned something terrible and is waiting for the commanding officer to discover it himself, because nobody wants to be the person who delivers the news. My intelligence officer was standing outside my quarters when I opened the door. His name was Torvan. Young, brilliant, the best analyst in my division and one of the best in the fleet. He had a mind that processed information the way a surgical instrument processes tissue, with absolute precision and zero wasted motion. I had never seen him rattled. I had never seen him show any emotional response to any piece of intelligence, no matter how alarming. He processed catastrophe with the same steady efficiency he brought to routine data review. His hands were shaking. He was holding a data tablet against his chest with both arms, the way a person holds something they are afraid of dropping. "Commander," he said, "something is happening. You need to see this now." He handed me the tablet. On the screen was a real-time tracking display of human vessel movements across known space. Every human ship was marked in blue. Under normal conditions, the display showed the predictable daily circulation of a thriving interstellar civilization. Trade routes poolsing between colony worlds like arteries carrying commerce. Supply lines feeding frontier settlements. Exploration vectors probing into unmapped sectors. Mining operations cycling between asteroid belts and processing stations. The heartbeat of a species spread across 47 worlds, steady and rhythmic and utterly routine. Every blue dot on the map had stopped. I stared at the display for a long time. Every human merchant vessel in known space, every freight hauler, every colony transport, every mining rig, every passenger liner, every exploration probe, every agricultural barge and orbital ferry and system patrol craft, every single human ship in the galaxy had gone dark at exactly the same time. Transponders disabled. Communications silent. Navigation beacons extinguished. As if someone had reached across 1,000 light years, and flipped a switch that turned off every human being in existence. The commercial impact was immediate and cascading. Human trade routes connected dozens of species across hundreds of commercial corridors. When those routes went silent, the ripple effects spread outward in every direction like cracks in breaking glass. Contracts unfulfilled. Deliveries halted. Markets that depended on human intermediaries grinding to a confused stop. Species that had never dealt with each other directly found themselves cut off from trading partners they could not even contact without the human relay infrastructure they had come to depend on. But the economic disruption was not what Torvald wanted me to see. He tapped the display, and the view shifted to the navigational corridor between Telvari space and the nearest human sector. There, in an area that had been empty vacuum 12 hours before, was a cloud of blue signals so dense the display software could barely render individual markers. They blurred together into a solid mass of blue, like a bruise spreading across the map. Thousands of vessels, all converging on the same heading, all moving toward our border. My training took over. I asked the question any military commander asks first when confronted with an incoming formation. How many warships are in that group? Torvald's face did something I had never seen it do before. Something shifted behind his eyes. It took me a moment to identify the expression because I had never associated it with him. Fear, genuine, uncontrolled fear. None, he said. Commander, there are no warships, not a single military vessel in the formation. They are all civilian ships, freighters, mining haulers, personal shuttles, colony transports, agricultural barges, orbital ferries, survey craft. Some of them are not even rated for deep space travel. I am tracking vessels that appear to have been modified for interstellar transit within the last 48 hours using improvised engineering. Some of them should not be flying at all. I asked who was aboard them. He told me, and 15 cycles of certainty collapsed like a structure that had been built on sand, and the sand had just shifted. They were parents. Every single person aboard those thousands of converging ships had a direct personal connection to one of the 206 children we had taken from Ariden 4. Not soldiers, not special forces, not the feared human marine corps that every species in the Conquered told stories about in low voices. Mothers, fathers, grandparents, aunts and uncles and godparents, neighbors who had watched those children grow up, teachers who had taught them to read. Family friends who had held them as infants. They had come from every human colony within transit range, some traveling for days already, others still arriving, their ships dropping out of faster-than-light travel and joining the mass like water flowing into a river that was already flooding its banks. I stood on my command deck and watched the swarm grow in real time on the tactical display. Every few minutes, another cluster of blue dots appeared at the edge of the screen, emerging from transit with no formation, no coordination, no identifiable command structure. Just people in ships, moving in the same direction. My tactical staff was confused. Some of them were openly amused. These were not warships. Most carried no weapons at all. The ones that had anything offensive were equipped with mining lasers and industrial cutting tools, equipment designed for cracking asteroids and welding hull plates. Repurposed with the clumsy desperation of people who grabbed whatever was in reach before running out the door. One grain hauler from Ariden 4 had welded scrap metal plates over its cockpit windows and carved crude, firing slits through them with a hand torch. It looked absurd. It looked like something built by children playing pretend. My second tactical officer, Drayle, pointed at it on the display and laughed. He said, "Commander, should we be concerned about the grain hauler with the dinner plates on its windows?" I almost laughed with him, almost. Then we intercepted the transmissions from inside the swarm, and nobody laughed again. They were broadcasting on open channels, completely unencrypted. Either they did not know we could hear them or they did not care. The transmissions were not tactical. There were no call signs, no fleet designations, no chains of command. What we heard was something else entirely. A woman named Claire calling across the formation for her husband's ship, which had launched from a different colony world. She was asking if anyone had visual contact with a blue freight shuttle with a dented port engine, because that was what he had been flying when she last spoke to him 2 days ago, and she had not heard from him since. Her voice was steady. She was not panicking. She was problem-solving. A man named Simon coordinating fuel transfers with 3 neighboring vessels because his shuttle did not carry enough range for the full journey, and he refused to turn back, so he needed someone willing to share. 2 ships answered within seconds. Neither asked for anything in return. An elderly woman whose voice shook with her years, but never once shook with doubt, broadcasting on an open channel that she had packed enough medical supplies for 40 children, and if anyone needed bandages or antibiotics or fever medication, they should dock with her shuttle. She said her name was Margaret, and she had been a nurse for 40 years, and she was not going to stop being one just because she was in the middle of empty space. A man named Owen sending a message to his brother asking him to take care of his dog. He said the dog's name was Patch, and he liked to sleep on the left side of the bed, and he needed his water bowl filled twice a day. Owen's voice cracked when he said the dog's name. It did not crack when he said he did not know if he was coming back. This was the language of a family organizing itself across the width of known space. People coordinating rides and sharing supplies and making arrangements for pets and loved ones left behind, all in the same tone of voice they might use to plan who was bringing what dish to a holiday gathering. Then one transmission stopped the air in my chest. It came from near the front of the formation. The speaker identified herself as Marin Aldi's, schoolteacher, Aridin 4, the colony we had hit. She began listing names, all 206 children spoken from memory. First name, family name, age, not read from a data file, not checked against a roster. Recited the way you recite something carved into the walls of your mind. Each name was given its own breath, its own moment of silence afterward. She spoke them the way a teacher speaks the names of students she has watched grow from small, uncertain children into slightly less small, slightly less uncertain children, year after year, morning after morning. When she finished, she spoke directly to us. Her voice did not change pitch or speed. She said, "We are not an army. We are not a negotiating party. We are coming to bring our children home. You can fire on us if you choose. That will not stop us. There are more of us behind the ones you can see. There will always be more behind us." I played the transmission 4 times. What disturbed me was not the content. It was what was missing. No anger, no grief, no desperation, no bluster. There was certainty. The calm, total, immovable certainty of a person who has weighed the full cost of what they are about to do, including the possibility of dying, and has accepted that cost without hesitation and moved on to practical matters. On a different channel, a man named Henry was speaking to his teenage son aboard a separate vessel. The son wanted to come along. Henry's voice was rough from lack of sleep but solid as the hull beneath his feet. He said, "Your sister is on that station. I am going to bring her home. You stay with your mother. If I do not come back, you are the oldest. You look after the family," the son argued, his voice cracking between anger and terror. Henry waited until the boy finished and then said, "This is not a discussion. I love you. Look after your mother." The channel went silent. Deeper in the swarm, my listening teams flagged a signal from a vessel so small it barely appeared on our instruments. A short-range orbital shuttle, the kind designed for routine hops between a planet's surface and its closest moon. Someone had modified it for interstellar travel using instructions downloaded from the Human Information Network. The modifications were crude. The engine was running beyond safe thermal parameters. Life support capacity was marginal at best. It should not have been in deep space. It should not have been anywhere except in a repair dock waiting for a qualified engineer to look at it. The pilot was a woman named Nora. She was alone. Someone in the swarm told her to turn back. Her shuttle was not going to survive the journey. She would run out of breathable air before she covered half the remaining distance. She said, "My boy is 6 years old. His name is Danny. He sleeps with a stuffed bear he has had since the day he was born. He did not have that bear when they took him. He cannot fall asleep without it. He tries. He lies there in the dark and he holds his own hands together because he does not have anything else to hold, and he cries without making noise because he does not want anyone to know he is scared." She held up a small, worn, brown stuffed animal to her cockpit camera. One of its button eyes was loose. Its fur was matted from years of being clutched through nightmares and thunderstorms and first days at new schools. "I am bringing Danny his bear," she said. "So you tell me which part of that sounds like something I am going to quit doing." Nobody in the swarm tried to talk her out of it again. Nobody offered alternatives or practical objections. Her channel went quiet with the particular quality of silence that occurs when a group of people have collectively recognized that they are in the presence of something they do not have the right to argue with. Late that night, I asked Torvon the question that had been circling in my head. Where was Earth's Navy? The human military could crack our station open without effort. Why allow civilians to fly into danger instead of handling it themselves? Torvon had spent 2 years living on a human world through a cultural exchange program. He understood things about them that existed in no database and no intelligence report. He was quiet for a long time after I asked. Then he said, "Their military is not leading this because it cannot, Commander. Those parents did not ask permission. They did not file flight plans. They did not wait for authorization from any chain of command. They got in their ships and they went. By the time Earth's military even understood what was happening, the swarm was already in deep space transit. And now their Navy will not intervene, because intervening would mean placing itself between those parents and their children. Even their own admirals know that standing in that road is not something you survive." He paused and then added, "Commander, I lived with these people for 2 years. I watched a human mother on the colony where I was stationed lift the front end of a ground vehicle off her trapped child with nothing but her hands. The vehicle weighed 4 times what any human body should be capable of moving. The physicians told her afterward that she had torn every muscle in her back and might never walk without pain. She said she did not remember lifting anything. She remembered her daughter was under the vehicle, and then she remembered her daughter was not under the vehicle. The in-between did not exist for her. That is not an exaggeration, Commander. That is what they are. And we just triggered it in 3,000 people at the same time." I dismissed his warning. I told him that emotional anecdotes were not intelligence analysis. I told him to focus on tactical projections and leave the behavioral speculation to me. I went to my quarters. I lay in the dark and listened to the hum of the ship and thought about a woman alone in a shuttle that was not built for where she was taking it, flying across the empty space between stars with a stuffed bear on the seat beside her because her 6-year-old could not sleep without it. I did not sleep, and I could not stop asking myself a question I did not have the answer to, a question that was growing heavier with every hour as the swarm on my tactical display grew larger. What had we done? The swarm reached our outermost defense perimeter 9 days after the abduction. By then, it had grown beyond accurate counting. Our best tracking estimates placed it between 2,500 and 3,000 individual vessels, but the number kept changing as new arrivals continued to drop out of faster-than-light transit and join the mass. They appeared on my tactical display in staggered waves, blooming across the screen like ink dropped into clear water, spreading and merging until the individual dots blurred together into a solid wall of blue moving toward my position. There was no formation, no vanguard element pushing ahead of the main body, no flanking screens protecting the sides, no reserve force held back for tactical adjustment, no recognizable military structure of any kind. Just a mass of ships pressing forward together, each finding its own path through the dark, all of them aimed at the same point in space. They moved the way a crowd moves through a city street, thousands of individual decisions producing a single collective direction, no one leading, no one following, everyone simply going where they needed to go. My interdiction line was ready and waiting. 12 heavy cruisers arranged in standard blockade formation, supported by 40 escort frigates positioned in overlapping defensive layers. My weapons officers had spent the long days of waiting running targeting drills and checking their systems until every gun on every ship was calibrated to sub-arc-second precision. The combined firepower of my interdiction line was sufficient to erase a civilian fleet 10 times the size of the incoming swarm in under 30 minutes. My captains were restless after more than a week of holding position with nothing to engage. Some of them were eager. They wanted this resolved. They wanted to demonstrate to these civilians and their patchwork ships that the Telvari Dominion's borders were not something you approached without consequence. I ordered the first warning broadcast on all available frequencies. Standard interdiction protocol. Every Telvari officer learns the words at the academy. This is the Telvari Dominion military. You are approaching a restricted military zone. All vessels are ordered to halt immediately, reverse course, and withdraw from this sector. Failure to comply will result in the application of lethal force. This warning will not be repeated. We repeated it 6 times over the next 30 minutes. Not one ship in the swarm acknowledged the transmission. Not one ship slowed down. Not one ship changed course by a single degree. They continued forward at the same steady, unhurried pace they had maintained since entering the sector, as if the warning were a natural sound the universe was making, like background radiation, something that existed but had no bearing on anything that mattered to them. I ordered a second broadcast, more specific this time. My communications officer transmitted precise coordinates for a safe withdrawal corridor and gave them a firm deadline. 20 minutes to begin turning around, or we would open fire. I made certain the language was unambiguous. There would be no further warnings. 19 minutes of silence. The swarm kept moving, nothing on any channel. In the 20th minute, a single response arrived. Marin Aldi's. Her voice was identical to the transmission from days before. Calm, measured, patient. The voice of a woman explaining something very simple to someone who has not yet understood it, but who she believes is capable of understanding if given enough time. "We heard your warning," she said. "We are not going to stop. Do what you feel you need to do." My weapons officer looked at me. His hand was resting on the authorization panel. I could see the readiness in his posture and the question in his eyes. I gave the order. Warning volley. Target empty space directly ahead of the lead vessels. High-energy broadside, close enough that the radiation wash would flood every cockpit window in the forward ranks with blinding white light. My cruisers fired. Brilliant lines of energy slashed through the darkness ahead of the swarm, detonating in expanding spheres of radiation close enough to make hull plating creak from thermal stress. Close enough that any rational crew would flinch, reconsider, and reverse course. The lead ships flew through the dissipating energy wash without changing direction by a fraction of a degree. If anything, the formation tightened. Ships moved closer together, narrowing the gaps between them, as if drawing comfort or courage from the proximity of their neighbors. I gave the next order with a sensation in the center of my chest that I recognize now as the first moment of genuine dread I had experienced in 30 years of military service. Targeted fire. Disable the lead vessels. Engine strikes only. Show them that we will use force and that their civilian hulls cannot withstand it. My gunners were the best in the fleet. They hit 3 ships in the forward wave with surgical precision, shearing engine sections away from the main hull in bright, clean strikes. 3 ships went dark and began to drift, powerless, their crews alive but going nowhere. The swarm did not react the way any military force in the recorded history of the galaxy has ever reacted to taking casualties. There was no evasive maneuvering, no scatter, no retreat, no attempt to regroup or establish a defensive posture. The ships nearest the disabled vessels adjusted their courses to fill the gaps where their neighbors had been, and the main body of the swarm flowed around the drifting hulks the way a river flows around stones in its bed, without slowing, without pausing. Without a single voice, on any channel suggesting withdrawal. Behind the leading edge, other ships peeled away from the formation to match velocity with the crippled vessels, locking towing cables onto their hulls, dragging them along with the rest of the group. They would not leave their own people behind, not even the ones who could no longer fly. I felt something shift inside me, a fracture forming in a place I had believed was solid. I had commanded ships in 3 fleet engagements. I had watched trained military formations, crewed by professional soldiers who had spent years preparing for combat, fragment and scatter under fire that was less intense than what I was directing at this civilian swarm. These people in their grain haulers and shuttle pods were absorbing casualties and closing ranks without a single order being issued, without a single leader directing the response, without any coordination beyond the raw, wordless instinct of a group of people who all wanted the same thing and would not be turned away from it. I made the decision that will define me for the rest of whatever existence awaits me beyond this tribunal. I ordered full engagement. Destroy any vessel that crosses the interdiction line. The first ship to cross was a mining freighter, old and slow and scarred with decades of asteroid dust ground into its hull plating. It crossed the invisible boundary I had drawn in space, and my nearest cruiser hit it with a full broadside. The freighter came apart in a silent white flash, expanding debris, venting atmosphere, the brief bright flare of something inside the hull catching fire and burning out in the vacuum. Then nothing, just fragments tumbling through the dark. The ship behind it did not turn. It flew through the expanding field of debris, through the drifting wreckage of the vessel that had been its neighbor moments before, and it crossed the line. My cruisers fired again, and again, and again. In the first hour, we destroyed 47 civilian ships, 47 vessels crewed by unarmed human beings who never fired a single shot in return, never broadcast a single hostile transmission, never altered course by a single degree. They simply flew forward into our guns and died, and behind each one that died, the next ship in line closed the gap and continued forward. After every kill, the surviving ships moved closer together, tightening the formation, filling the empty space where someone had just been erased from existence. And they kept coming, always forward, only ever forward. I was standing on my command deck watching blue markers disappear from the tactical display one by one, and I realized that my hands were trembling, not from the cold air cycling through the bridge ventilation system, from fear. The raw, unprocessed, physical fear that I had not experienced since I was a 20-year-old junior officer on my very first combat deployment, before I had learned to compartmentalize terror behind discipline and training. I was afraid. But I was not afraid of their firepower, because they had none. I was not afraid of their tactical capability, because they had none. I was afraid of what I was looking at. I was afraid of what kind of species watches the ship beside them vanish in a ball of fire and responds by steering closer to the source of the fire. A transmission broke through from one of the ships we had just crippled. A man's voice, thin and strained, his hull breached and his atmosphere whistling away into the vacuum. He was using the last minutes of breathable air in his cockpit to broadcast on every open frequency a message that was not addressed to us. "My daughter's name is Lily," he said. "She is 7 years old. She has brown hair and she draws pictures of horses on everything she can reach. On her homework, on the margins of her books, on the walls of her bedroom, on her own arms with colored markers when she runs out of paper. If you find her, tell her that her dad was coming. Tell her I was almost there." His signal cut out. The swarm kept coming. My weapons crews started breaking, not all at once, in fragments. A gunner with 15 years of service and multiple commendations for precision under fire requested immediate relief from his station. When I demanded to know why, he stood at rigid attention and could not look at me. He said, "Commander, I have been destroying unarmed civilian vessels for 3 hours. They do not fire back. They do not change course. They do not try to dodge or hide or run. And before each ship goes dark, someone on board says their child's name. I hear a child's name every time I fire my weapon, and I cannot do it anymore. I am asking to be relieved, Commander. Please." I denied his request because I needed every weapon station manned. But I understood what was happening inside him because I could feel the same thing happening inside me. Every kill was costing us something that ammunition and power cells could not replace. Something was being spent with each trigger pull that could not be recharged between engagements. Then the dying ships at the front of the formation began doing something that changed the texture of everything that followed. Ships that had already been crippled, vessels that were venting atmosphere and losing power and had minutes or seconds of life left in them, began to accelerate. Not away from my cruisers, toward them. A freight hauler with half its starboard hull sheared away aimed itself at one of my escort frigates and drove straight into its side at maximum remaining thrust. The hauler crumpled on impact like paper crushed against stone, but the collision knocked the frigate's primary targeting array offline for nearly 2 minutes. 2 minutes during which dozens of human ships surged through the gap in my line. This happened again, and again. Across the entire length of the interdiction line, dying ships were spending their final seconds as blunt instruments, each pilot independently making the same decision without orders, without communication, without coordination. My life is already over. The question is not whether I die. The question is whether my death opens a door for someone behind me. One of my cruiser captains, an officer I had served with for a decade, a man I considered one of the steadiest commanders in the fleet, contacted me on a private channel. His voice was wrong. Too flat. Too controlled. The voice of someone who is holding himself together with both hands and can feel his grip slipping. "Commander," he said, "I need new orders. My crew is coming apart. We have been firing on unarmed people for hours and they will not stop coming. 3 of my gunners have refused to fire. 2 more have requested medical leave citing psychological distress. My chief medical officer has asked permission to render aid to survivors of a ship we destroyed. I need you to tell me what we are fighting. I need a name for what this is. Because this is not an enemy, Commander. I have fought enemies. They behave differently than this. I do not have a word for what is happening to us." I did not have an answer for him. I did not have one for myself. While my fleet was being worn down at the border, something was happening inside the station where we held the children. I learned the details later from security recordings, and I need the tribunal to hear them, because they prove that whatever force was pushing those ships through our guns, it is not something humans are taught. It is not cultural conditioning. It is not learned behavior. It is something they carry in their bones from the moment they draw their first breath. The children had woken up. Our medical teams calculated sedation dosages using metabolic models adjusted for human physiology based on adult baseline data. What they failed to account for was that human children process foreign compounds at metabolic rates that dramatically exceed adult parameters. Their young bodies attack the sedation agents with a biological aggressiveness that our pharmacologists had not predicted. The dosages designed to maintain unconsciousness for 16 hours wore off in less than 8. 206 children opened their eyes in an alien facility. The lights were wrong. The air smelled wrong. The walls were the wrong color and the wrong texture, and the sounds coming from the corridor outside were sounds that no human child had ever heard before. They were surrounded by tall alien figures in unfamiliar uniforms speaking a language that came through translation devices as flat, mechanical approximations of words. The first thing they did was not cry. Some of the youngest ones cried, briefly, the way small children cry when they wake from a nightmare, a sharp burst of sound that trails off when they realize no one familiar is responding. But what happened next was not crying. What happened next was organization. Sophie, 13 years old, brown hair, quiet by temperament, the kind of student who sits in the middle of the classroom and watches everything and says very little but misses nothing. She was the first to move. She gathered the youngest children, the 4 and 5 and 6-year-olds who were disoriented and frightened and calling for parents who were not there, and she pulled them into a cluster near the warmest section of lighting in the ward. She spoke to them in a voice that was deliberately, forcibly steady, a voice she was constructing in real time through sheer willpower, the voice of someone who is terrified and has decided that being terrified is not an option right now because other people need her to be something else. She assigned the older children as watchers for each group. She told the younger ones that their parents were coming and they just needed to be brave for a little while. She said it with such conviction that several of them stopped crying immediately, not because they believed her, because they believed that she believed it, and that was enough. Ben, 12 years old, skinny, restless, the kind of boy who takes things apart to see how they work and does not always remember to put them back together. He found the ward's internal communication panel mounted on the far wall. He studied its interface for 20 minutes, poking at controls, tracing circuit paths with his finger, tilting his head the way a mechanic tilts their head when listening to an engine that is not running right. Then he shorted the panel in a precise sequence that sent random bursts of static flooding through the station's security monitoring channels. Our surveillance teams spent hours chasing phantom alerts and system errors before they realized a 12-year-old boy with no training and no tools had compromised their communications infrastructure, using nothing but observation and stubbornness. The children built a barricade, not a symbolic gesture, a functional defensive position. Beds were dragged from their frames and overturned. Chairs were stacked and wedged against the bed frames. Meal trays were propped as makeshift shields. Storage containers were pushed into gaps. Everything in the ward that could be moved was dragged, carried, or kicked into a wall that stretched across one entire section of the room. The youngest children were placed behind it. The older ones stood in front. When a Telvari guard approached the barricade to assess the situation, a 9-year-old girl named Grace picked up a metal meal tray and threw it at his face. Her aim was precise. The tray caught him across the bridge of his nose and staggered him back 2 steps. She followed the throw with a single word that our translation system flagged as an extremely crude human profanity, a word she had learned from her father, who was a dock worker on Aridon 4 and apparently had a vocabulary that he did not fully succeed in keeping from his daughter. The guard was armed. He was armored. He was twice her height and 3 times her weight. He looked at this 9-year-old girl standing in front of a barricade made of furniture, her chin raised, her hands balled into fists at her sides, her eyes bright with a fury that was half terror and half something else. Something that looked exactly like the expression on the face of the woman who had picked up the red shoe from the schoolyard grass. He backed away from the barricade and reported to his supervisor that the situation was under control. It was not under control. The children had seized a quarter of the ward and were defending it with thrown objects, creative profanity, and a ferocity that should not have been possible from people who weighed less than the weapons the guards were carrying. I studied those security recordings with the attention I should have given to my intelligence reports before the operation. What I saw changed my understanding of this species in a way that no amount of future study could undo. Those children were terrified. The evidence was in every frame: trembling lips, hands that shook even when clenched into fists, wet eyes that blinked too fast, the smallest children clutching each other so tightly their knuckles were white. The older ones holding their voices level through pure force of will, the effort visible in the tendons of their necks and the rigid set of their jaws. But fear did not paralyze them. Fear organized them. It sharpened their thinking and accelerated their reactions and focused their attention and turned a random collection of frightened children into a functioning unit with roles and positions and a single clear objective: hold the barricade, protect the little ones, wait for help. They were 9 years old and 12 years old, and they were doing what trained soldiers sometimes cannot do at the age of 30. They were being afraid and performing anyway. Back at the border, the swarm finally broke through. Over 160 ships destroyed. 3 of my escort frigates knocked offline by ramming damage. My weapons crews psychologically shattered, not by combat, but by the sustained moral horror of killing people who refused to behave as enemies. The human ships poured through the fractures in my interdiction line like water through a crumbling dam, and I gave the order to pull my remaining forces back and consolidate them in a defensive sphere around the station. I stood on my command deck and watched nearly 2,000 battered civilian ships arrange themselves around the facility where their children slept behind a wall of overturned furniture. And I understood, with the terrible clarity that only arrives after you have already made every wrong choice that was available to you, that I was not facing a fleet. I was not facing a nation. I was not facing a doctrine or a strategy or anything my training had a name for. I was facing a family, and I was the thing standing between its members. The cutting started at what the station's internal systems registered as dawn, and it did not stop for 14 hours. The remnants of the civilian swarm could not breach the station's military-grade shielding with their improvised weapons. They did not waste time trying. Instead, they landed directly on the hull, touching down on the station's armored outer surface in 1s and 2s and small clusters, their battered ships settling onto the metal plating like insects on a fallen log. They climbed out in vacuum suits, and they went to work on the hull with whatever tools they had carried with them across the width of known space. Mining lasers designed for cutting through asteroid rock, plasma torches meant for shipyard welding, Industrial drills built for borehole operations on airless moons. Cutting discs and grinding wheels and handheld saws that whined and sparked against military-grade armor plating that had been engineered to withstand direct weapons fire. One man caught my attention on the external camera feeds and held it for a long time. A dockworker named George from a colonial outpost I had never heard of. He was carrying nothing but a handheld grinding tool, the kind used in shipyards for smoothing weld seams after hull repairs. A finishing tool, not a cutting tool. At maximum speed, working without pause, it would take him 2 full standard days to grind through the station's outer armor plating with that device. 2 days of continuous work in a vacuum suit, with limited air, and no guarantee that anyone would still be alive on the other side when he finally broke through. He found a seam joint in the outer hull, pressed the grinder against it, and started working. Sparks drifted away from his position in lazy spirals, tiny orange fireflies disappearing into the black. He worked with the steady, unhurried patience of a man who had done hard physical labor every single day of his adult life, and understood in his bones that the only way through a job too big to think about was to start it and not stop until it was finished. I counted over 300 people on the hull, scattered across the station's surface in clusters, each group focused on its own section of armor. Some worked in organized teams of 6 or 8, combining their cutting tools to focus overlapping heat on single weak points. Others worked alone, grinding and burning and cutting with a methodical patience that unsettled my tactical officers in ways none of them could quite articulate. These people were not trying to breach the station quickly. Speed was not part of their calculation. They had no extraction window. They had no tactical deadline. They had no operational timeline of any kind. They had the rest of their lives, however many hours or days those lives contained, and they were prepared to spend every remaining second of those lives cutting through metal to reach the children on the other side. When one person's air supply ran low, they would cycle back to their ship, swap tanks, and return to the same spot on the hull. When a tool overheated and burned out, someone else would rotate into their position and pick up where they had left off. It was shift work. Organized, methodical, unglamorous shift work. The same kind of steady, patient labor that humans used to build their colonies and harvest their crops and keep their civilization running across 47 worlds. They had taken the most desperate act of their lives and turned it into a job that needed doing. A job they would do until it was done or until they were dead, whichever came first, and they did not appear to have a strong preference between the two outcomes as long as the work continued. My engineering officer ran calculations and reported that at the current collective rate of hull degradation, the first full penetration would occur within approximately 14 hours. I ordered defensive positions throughout the station's interior, armed soldiers at every projected breach point, kill zones established in the corridors leading to the children's ward, overlapping fields of fire, fallback positions prepared in sequence, everything my training prescribed for an interior defense scenario. Then I pulled up the security feed from the children's ward and saw something that made every tactical preparation feel like an exercise in irrelevance. The children had heard the cutting. Through layers of hull plating and thermal insulation and structural framework, the high-pitched whine of plasma torches biting into metal carried into the ward like a distant, persistent song. A sound that did not stop. A sound that grew slowly louder as the hours passed, and the cutting deepened, and the gap between the torches and the interior wall narrowed inch by inch. The older children recognized what the sound meant immediately. Sophie was standing at the barricade with tears running freely down her face and the widest, most radiant smile I had ever seen on a human being of any age. "Listen," she told the younger ones. "Everybody be quiet and listen. Put your hands flat on the wall. Can you feel that? That vibration, that humming sound? That is our mums and dads. They are right outside. They are cutting through the walls to get to us. They are coming." The smallest children pressed their palms and their ears against the walls of the ward, and they listened to the sound of their parents grinding through a military space station with borrowed tools. Some of them closed their eyes. Some of them smiled. And then, one by one, they began to laugh. Not nervous laughter. Not the forced, brittle laughter of children trying to convince themselves that everything is fine when they know it is not. Real laughter. Clean, bright, ringing laughter. The spontaneous, uncontrollable laughter of children who have been holding fear at arm's length for longer than any child should ever have to, and who have just been given permission to believe that the nightmare is ending. That laughter traveled through the corridors of my station. It echoed off metal walls and carried through ventilation ducts and reached the ears of my soldiers stationed in their kill zones with their weapons charged and ready. Armed men and women positioned to defend the Telvari Dominion's sovereign territory against an unauthorized incursion, listening to children laugh through the walls they had been ordered to hold. Something changed. I felt it through the security feeds, a loosening in the posture of my troops, a softening in the way they held their weapons. The thing that makes a soldier willing to fire on command without hesitation, that mechanical obedience that years of training build, layer by careful layer, into the foundation of a military mind, that thing was coming undone. I could see it in their faces, in the way they glanced at each other, in the way their eyes moved toward the walls where the laughter was coming from, and then moved away and then moved back again. My station was choosing a side, and it was not choosing mine. At hour 6, a section of outer hull plating buckled inward with a groaning shriek of stressed metal. A beam of torchlight punched through the gap. A ragged cheer erupted from the hull outside, transmitted through suit radios and captured by our external microphones. Voices, names, parents calling out through the gap to children they could not yet see. Danny, Sophie, Lily, Ben Grace. Names shouted into a hole in the wall of a military installation, each one carrying a weight that no rank insignia could match. At hour 9, the first compromised airlock was forced open from outside. Marin Aldi's walked through it. Unarmed, her vacuum suit was 2 sizes too large and streaked with black carbon scoring from hours of proximity to plasma torch work. She pulled her helmet off and tucked it under one arm as if she had just come inside from checking the weather. Her hair was matted with dried sweat. Her hands were blistered and raw from holding a borrowed cutting tool for longer than any pair of hands should hold anything. She looked exhausted in a way that went deeper than muscles and bones. But she also looked like a person who had arrived exactly where she intended to be, on schedule and without apology. 8 armed Telvari soldiers were waiting in the corridor on the other side of the airlock. Standard defensive formation, weapons raised, targeting lasers painting bright dots on Marin's chest. They shouted commands in voices trained to convey absolute authority. Halt, get on the ground, put your hands above your head, do not move. She walked toward them, not fast, not with aggression. She walked the way a person walks down a hallway in a building where they belong. She reached the first soldier and stopped. She was a full head shorter than him. She tilted her face up and looked into his eyes and held his gaze. The expression she wore was not rage. It was not hatred. It was not contempt or defiance or any of the things a soldier is trained to expect from an enemy combatant. It was disappointment. Deep, quiet, immovable disappointment. The look of a woman who has spent 30 years teaching children about the difference between right and wrong, and is now standing in front of a grown adult who has chosen wrong and knows it, and cannot hide that knowledge from her no matter how tightly he grips his weapon or how loudly he shouts his commands. The soldier lowered his gun. His arms dropped to his sides as if the weapon had suddenly become too heavy for any living thing to hold. She walked past him. She walked past the next one and the next one and the next one, all 8 of them. Not one fired. Not one moved to stop her. They stood in that corridor, and they let a 51-year-old schoolteacher walk through them as if their weapons and their armor and their training were made of smoke. When I interviewed those soldiers later, the youngest of them, 19 years old on his very first deployment, gave me the only answer that came close to making sense. He said, "Commander, she looked at me the way my mother looks at me when I have done something she raised me better than. I could not fire on her. She was someone's mother. She was everyone's mother." My hands refused. Behind Marin, a steady stream of parents came through the breach. Jack, with both hands burned raw from 9 continuous hours of torch work, his skin cracked and weeping, and he did not seem to notice his hands at all. Helen, carrying a medical kit, dropping to one knee beside a Telvari guard who had been cut by flying shrapnel during the hull breach, cleaning and bandaging his wound while he stared at her in total incomprehension. A man named Liam cradling a broken arm against his chest. A bone fractured when a hull plate shifted during the cutting, walking past armed soldiers without a glance, because nothing between him and the children's ward registered as important enough to acknowledge. Marin reached the ward door, locked from outside by our security system. She knocked, 3 soft knocks, the kind a person uses on a child's bedroom door in the middle of the night when checking on them during a storm. A small voice from inside said, "Who is that?" Marin's composure broke for the first and only time. Her voice cracked on the first syllable. She said, "It is Miss Aldi's, sweetheart. Your mum and dad are right behind me. We are going to open this door now. Everything is going to be all right." The sound that came from behind that door is something I will hear in my sleep for the rest of my life. 200 children releasing days of accumulated terror in a single eruption of relief, not a scream of fear, a release of it. The high, bright, shattering sound of children who had held themselves together through sheer force of will for longer than any child should ever have to. Finally letting go because a voice they recognized, a voice that meant safety and routine and normal life, was on the other side of the wall. I ordered the door opened. What happened next does not fit into military language, and I will not attempt to force it. A father named Colin dropped to the floor and pulled his daughter into his arms with a force that made her yelp. And then she laughed, and then she pushed her face into his neck and went completely still, as if she was trying to merge with him, to climb inside him where nothing could reach her ever again. A mother named Laura was shaking so badly her hands could not close around her son, and Marin had to guide the boy into his mother's arms and hold them both steady until the trembling subsided enough for Laura to stand on her own. Ben, the 12-year-old who had shorted the communication system and helped build the barricade, saw his grandfather come through the door. The old man was limping heavily, one leg wrapped in improvised bandaging from a debris wound he had taken during the hull breach. He had walked through half the station on that leg. Ben looked at him and did not run forward. He sat down on the floor, slowly, as though the strength he had been holding in reserve for 9 days had simply emptied out of his body all at once. His grandfather lowered himself to the floor beside him and put a heavy arm around the boy's shoulders, and they sat there together in silence while the noise and tears and desperate laughter of reunion filled the ward around them. Then my security team flagged something on the tactical overlay that changed the calculation entirely. A big man named Patrick had come through the entrance and gathered his 2 children, a boy of 8 and a girl of 5, against his chest. Beneath his vacuum suit, he was wearing a mining vest fitted with 6 industrial blasting charges wired in sequence along his ribs. In his right hand, held behind his children's backs where they could not see it, was a dead man's switch. If he released the pressure on that switch, the charges would detonate and take a quarter of the station with them. He was not the only one. As more parents entered the ward, my security teams identified over 30 individuals carrying improvised explosive devices strapped to their bodies and wired to dead man's switches held in clenched fists. Fathers with det cord wound around their torsos under heavy jackets. Mothers with mining charges taped to their ribs beneath layers of clothing. A grandmother in her 60s with enough industrial explosive strapped to her body to collapse the entire corridor she was standing in. Every single one of them was holding their child with one arm and holding oblivion with the other hand. These were not fighters. These were not terrorists. These were people who had made a decision before they ever set foot on my station. They were going to leave with their children. That was the only outcome they would accept. If that outcome became impossible, if someone tried to take those children from them a second time, they were going to make certain that this station would never hold anyone's child again. It was not a threat. It was not a negotiating tactic. It was a statement of fact, as simple and as final as a closed door. My second-in-command, Drayle, was at my side. His voice was tight. "Commander, we must retake the ward. They have brought explosive devices onto a Telvari military installation. This is an unacceptable security failure. This is weakness." I turned and looked at him. I said, "We are not showing weakness, Drayle. We are making the first intelligent decision anyone in this chain of command has made since the day I ordered those children taken from their homes. All units stand down immediately. Allow the evacuation to proceed. Nobody touches anyone. Nobody raises a weapon. Nobody interferes. Drayle stared at me as if I had lost my mind. I held his eyes until he looked away. The parents organized the evacuation with the same steady efficiency they had brought to every phase of this operation, checking each child, counting heads, matching names to faces, making certain nobody was overlooked. Marin Aldi's walked the length of the ward one final time, checking every corner, every shadow, every space behind every piece of furniture where a small child might have curled up and been missed. The schoolteacher doing attendance, even here, even at the edge of everything. As the last groups moved through the corridor toward the breach, something happened that I have thought about more than any other moment in this entire ordeal. More than the ships, more than the border, more than the dead man's switches and the burned hands and the 9-year-old girl who threw a tray at an armed soldier and told him exactly what she thought of him. A small girl, 5 years old, with brown hair and eyes still puffy from days of crying, pulled free of her mother's hand and walked up to one of my guards. He was standing against the corridor wall. His weapon was on the floor beside his feet. He had been one of the ward guards, one of the soldiers who had spent days on the other side of the barricade, absorbing thrown trays and shouted words and the unblinking defiance of children who were half his size and twice his courage. The girl reached into the pocket of the small jacket she had been wearing since the day of the abduction. She pulled out a piece of candy, wrapped in bright paper. The kind of small treasure a child keeps in a pocket for emergencies, for bad days, for moments when something sweet might make the world a little easier to bear. She held it up to the guard. He looked down at her. He did not understand what was happening. She said, through the translation device clipped to her collar, "Do not be sad. My daddy says it is okay to be scared." She placed the candy in his open palm. She patted his hand once, gently, the way a child pats a pet that is trembling. Then she turned and ran back to her mother and took her hand and walked toward the breach without looking back. The guard stood in that corridor, holding a piece of candy in a hand that had forgotten how to close. He was a decorated veteran. 3 combat deployments. Commendations for composure under fire. He had been trained to withstand interrogation, to function under extreme physical duress, to maintain operational effectiveness in conditions that would break most sentient beings. He looked down at that bright little wrapper sitting in his palm, and his face came apart. Everything behind it, everything that training and discipline and years of military service had built and reinforced and maintained, all of it collapsed at once, like a wall that has been holding back water for so long that everyone forgot the water was there. He walked into an empty storage compartment, and he stayed there, alone, holding a piece of candy, until every human being had left the station. I did not discipline him. There was nothing to discipline. He had not failed in his duty. He had been defeated, more completely and more permanently than any weapon in any arsenal could have managed, by a 5-year-old girl and a piece of candy and a single sentence that cut through every defense he had ever built around his heart. The last human ship detached from the station's hull 4 hours later. I watched it pull away on the external cameras, trailing a thin ribbon of atmosphere from a hull seal that had not set properly. Behind it, the remnants of the swarm, smaller now, scarred and diminished by loss but unbroken in its cohesion, formed a protective sphere around the departing ships and began the long journey home. I stood on my command deck in the silence they left behind and understood with total clarity what the Telvari Dominion had lost. Not a battle. Battles have structure. Winners, losers, terms, boundaries, clean edges you can draw on a map. This was not a battle. We had lost something that could not be recovered through negotiation or reparation or the passage of time. We had lost the belief that we were the strong ones. We had looked into the face of something we could not comprehend, and we had blinked. I stand before the Galactic Conquered Tribunal today as a stripped officer, a disgraced commander, and the last surviving senior architect of what historians across 12 species have already begun calling the greatest strategic miscalculation in modern galactic history. My rank has been removed. My commission has been revoked. The government that gave me my orders no longer exists. I am not here to offer a defense of my actions, because there is no defense. I am here to deliver a warning, and I intend to take my time with it, because I need every delegate in this chamber to understand what I am about to say with sufficient depth and clarity that they carry it home to their governments and their military planners and their intelligence divisions, and make absolutely certain that nobody repeats the mistake I made. Earth did not declare war. I need every species represented in this chamber to sit with that fact for as long as it takes to fully absorb its implications. We abducted 206 human children from a peaceful frontier colony. We held them aboard a military installation deep in sovereign Telvari space. We fired upon unarmed civilian vessels that came to recover those children. We destroyed over 160 ships. We killed 412 human beings, mothers, fathers, grandparents, teachers, neighbors, family friends, ordinary people in ordinary ships who crossed the width of known space to bring their families home. We did all of that, and their species did not declare war on us. They did not need to. The footage from the civilian fleet reached galactic media networks within hours of the evacuation. Every species in the conquered saw it. They saw the grain haulers and the mining freighters and the shuttle pods flying into the concentrated fire of 12 heavy cruisers without changing course. They saw the dying ships steering into our frigates to buy seconds for the ships behind them. They saw the parents on the hull, cutting through military armor with tools designed for asteroids and welding jobs, working in shifts for 14 hours without pause. They saw the reunions in the children's ward, fathers on their knees clutching daughters who laughed and cried in the same breath, mothers shaking so hard they could not hold the children they had crossed the galaxy to reach. They saw the 5-year-old girl put a piece of candy in the hand of the guard, who had been her jailer for 9 days, and they heard her tell him that her daddy said it was okay to be scared. They saw the body of a father drifting in the wreckage of his destroyed shuttle, his final transmission still cycling on automated repeat, saying his daughter's name, and telling anyone who was listening that she was 7 years old and she was afraid of the dark. The galactic response was not military. It was something far more devastating to the Telvari Dominion than any fleet engagement could have been, because you can rebuild after a military defeat. You can replace ships and retrain crews and renegotiate borders. You cannot rebuild after what happened to us. 12 species formally condemned the Telvari Dominion within 72 standard hours of the footage reaching public networks. The Rithani Collective, which had maintained strict diplomatic neutrality in every interstellar dispute for over a century, broke their silence in a public broadcast to call the abduction an act of barbarism unworthy of a civilized species. The Ocean Directorate, which had never in its recorded history issued a public statement regarding the internal conduct of another species, transmitted a formal denunciation in 7 languages, and suspended all scientific cooperation with Telvari institutions indefinitely. The Velesi Commonwealth, our oldest and most reliable trading partner, our closest ally. The species we had built 40 years of economic partnership with through careful diplomacy and mutual benefit, recalled their ambassador from our homeworld and severed every active agreement between our governments in a single broadcast statement that was watched by billions of beings across the conquered. In that statement, they used the word evil, not regrettable, not misguided, not a strategic error, evil. The conquered itself acted with a speed and a severity that had no precedent in its 200-year institutional history. Total economic isolation of the Telvari Dominion. Technology embargoes covering every category of advanced systems. Immediate revocation of our access to shared scientific databases and research networks. Suspension of our representatives from all conquered proceedings. Trade agreements that had sustained our economy for decades dissolved within days. Our currency collapsed. Supply chains that our industries depended upon ceased to function. Companies on allied worlds refused to process transactions from Telvari accounts. Shipping firms would not carry our cargo. Academic institutions returned our collaborative research proposals unopened. Banks froze our foreign assets. In the span of a single week, the Telvari Dominion went from being a respected member of the galactic community to the most isolated species in known space. And all of it happened without Earth applying a single gram of political pressure. Their government did not lobby for sanctions. Their diplomats did not pressure other species behind closed doors. They did not need to. The footage did the work. You cannot watch a grandmother cut through a warship's armored hull with a plasma torch to reach her grandchildren, and then choose to side with the people who made that necessary. The moral arithmetic is too simple. The equation has only one answer. Every species that watched that footage arrived at the same conclusion independently, without consultation, without coordination, because the truth of what they were seeing was too obvious and too heavy for any amount of political framing to lift. The Dominion government collapsed within 2 standard cycles, not primarily from external pressure, though the pressure was immense. It collapsed from within. When the footage reached our own homeworld, when ordinary Telvari citizens watched what had been done in their name by officers wearing their flag on their uniforms, the reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Protests erupted on a scale our domestic security forces had never confronted. Work stoppages shut down major industries. Military officers returned their commissions. Enlisted soldiers refused deployment orders. The governing council attempted to control the narrative. They released statements calling the operation a regrettable but necessary strategic measure. They called the parents who came for their children aggressors. They called the human response disproportionate. Nobody believed them. The framing could not hold. You cannot watch a woman knock gently on a locked door and ask a frightened child if they are all right, and then accept a press release that calls that woman an aggressor. The narrative collapses. The words lose their meaning. The gap between what the government is saying and what people's own eyes have shown them becomes too wide for any bridge. A transitional council took power and immediately opened reparation negotiations with Earth. The terms presented by human diplomats were severe and comprehensive. Full territorial withdrawal from every contested system. Economic reparations calculated at a scale that would take our economy a generation to absorb. Formal admission of wrongdoing entered into the conquered's permanent record. The Transitional Council accepted every term without counteroffer. There was nothing to negotiate. We had done something that every sentient being in the galaxy, regardless of species or political alignment or historical relationship, recognized as fundamentally wrong. The only path forward was to accept the consequences without qualification or complaint. And Earth still did not declare war. Instead, they did something that I believe will prove more significant and more enduring than any military victory in the history of interstellar conflict. On every human world, every colony, every settlement, every research station and mining outpost where their species had put down roots, they planted a garden. Each garden contained exactly 206 trees, 1 tree for each child who had been taken. The species of tree varied from world to world, selected to match local soil conditions and climate patterns, but the number was always the same. Always 206, on every world, without exception. They called these gardens the reminder, not the memorial, not the monument, not the tribute, the reminder. They chose that word deliberately, and the distinction matters. A memorial honors something that is finished. A memorial looks backward. A reminder looks forward. A reminder says this happened and it must never happen again, and here is something living and growing that will make sure you do not forget. Those gardens were not about grief. They were not about anger. They were about making certain that every human being, on every world, in every generation yet to come, would grow up in sight of 206 trees, and know the story those trees represented and carry that story with them into whatever future they were building. 3 cycles after the incident, I was permitted to visit one of these gardens as part of a diplomatic reconciliation mission. The colony on Saren's Hope, a temperate world with tall grass and wide skis that reminded me painfully of Aridon 4. The garden was on a hill overlooking the main settlement. 206 young trees arranged in concentric circles around a small clearing at the summit. The trees were still slender, still growing, their branches reaching upward with the patient determination of living things that have no concept of hurry and no intention of stopping. In the clearing was a single bench made of plain wood, the kind a person might build in their own workshop over a weekend. On the bench was a small metal plaque. I sat down and read it. The plaque did not mention the Telvari Dominion. It did not reference the abduction or the rescue or the civilian fleet or the 412 people who gave their lives. It contained 2 words. They came home. I sat on that bench for a very long time. The wind moved through the young trees around me, and they made a sound like whispering, like 206 voices speaking softly to each other about something too important to say aloud. I thought about the fundamental error that had made all of this possible, not the tactical mistakes. I understood those thoroughly. I was thinking about something deeper, something structural, a flaw not in my planning but in my understanding. Every prediction the Dominion had ever made about human behavior was built on observable data, trade patterns, military deployments, diplomatic precedents, economic indicators. We studied their outputs and reverse-engineered the logic that produced them. We modeled humanity the way you model a mechanical system. Watch what it does, measure the inputs and outputs, calculate what it will do next under a given set of conditions. But humans are not a mechanical system. Their behavior does not follow consistent, reproducible logic. And the reason is something I have spent the years since the incident trying to name and understand. I call it the variable that no model can capture. The element in human psychology that does not respond to incentives, does not respond to threats, does not respond to rational self-interest analysis, does not respond to any of the inputs that every other species in the conquered uses to make decisions. It responds to one thing and one thing only: the knowledge that somewhere, a child is afraid and alone and waiting for someone to come. I spoke with Marin Aldi's one final time, months after the evacuation, during a structured reconciliation dialogue that both governments had agreed to. I did not know what to expect from her. I had prepared myself for anger, for cold silence, for bitter accusations. She had watched people she cared about die during the approach to the station. She had spent hours cutting through military armor with a tool she had borrowed from a stranger. She had walked through a corridor of armed soldiers who had every reason and every authorization to end her life, and she had done it without raising her hands. She did not look angry. She looked tired, tired in a way that went deeper than physical exhaustion, tired the way a person looks when they have been carrying something impossibly heavy for a very long time and have only just, in this moment, been allowed to set it down. I asked her the question that had lived in my mind every day since the operation, not why the parents came. That answer was self-evident. I asked why she came, specifically, personally. She was a school teacher, not a parent of any of the abducted children. She had no genetic connection to any of them, no biological imperative, no familial obligation that would explain the risks she had assumed and the price she had been willing to pay. She looked at me the way a person looks at someone who has asked a question so strange that it takes a moment to process that the question was asked sincerely, as if I had asked her to explain why she needed to breathe. She said, "They were my students, Commander. I knew every single one of them. I knew that Sophie Calloway organizes everyone around her when she gets frightened because imposing order on chaos is how she manages her own fear. I knew that Ben Marsh pretends not to care about anything, but every single morning before class, he would walk through the younger children's area and quietly check that nobody was sitting alone. I knew that Grace Hadwell has an arm like a professional athlete and a vocabulary she should not have acquired for at least 5 more years. I knew that Danny Albright cannot sleep without his bear. I knew that Lily Harding draws horses on everything. I knew what each of them looked like when they were confused, and when they were proud, and when they were trying not to cry." She stopped for a moment. When she continued, her voice was quiet, but it carried a weight that pressed against the walls of the room. "You need to understand something, Commander. We did not come for those children because we are brave people. Bravery had nothing to do with it. We came because not coming was not something we were capable of doing. It was never a choice. There was no moment where I sat down and weighed the risks and decided the potential outcome justified the danger. My students were taken. I went. The way you pull your hand away from a flame, the way your lungs take a breath without being told, it is not a decision. It is what we are. Not a choice. I have spent years turning that phrase over in my mind, testing it against human history, against their literature, against their behavioral patterns across millennia of recorded civilization. And I have concluded that Marin Aldi's was telling me the truth in the most literal and precise way the truth can be told. When it comes to their children, humans do not make decisions. They do not deliberate. They do not perform cost-benefit analyses. Something deeper than conscious thought takes control. Something embedded in the oldest, most fundamental architecture of their brains. Something that existed long before language or reason or civilization. Something that predates everything they have built and everything they have become. It is not courage. Courage requires a choice between acting and not acting. This is more fundamental than courage. It is reflex. It is gravity. It is the direction water flows, not because the water decided to flow that way, but because flowing in any other direction would require the laws of the physical universe to be different than they are. That is what we triggered when we took those children. We did not provoke a government. We did not antagonize a military. We tripped a wire that runs through every human being alive, connecting each of them to every other through the shared experience of having once been small, once been helpless, once been completely dependent on someone who would do anything, pay any price, cross any distance, to keep them safe. Every species in this tribunal chamber has offspring, future generations, the biological imperative toward continuity. For most of us, that imperative is managed, rational, integrated into our decision-making frameworks and governed by our cost-benefit assessments. We protect our young because it serves the survival of our species. It is a calculation, and like all calculations, it has boundaries. There is a cost too high. There is a risk too great. There is a point at which the rational mind looks at the numbers and says this cannot be done, and the drive to protect steps aside and allows reason to take over. Humans do not have that point. The boundary does not exist. There is no cost too high. There is no risk too great. There is no distance too far, no wall too thick, no weapon too powerful, no enemy too numerous. There is only the space between a parent and their child, and a human being will cross that space or die in the attempt. And if they die, another will step forward to take their place, and another after that, and another after that, until the space is closed and the child is safe. This is my warning. I deliver it not as a Telvari, not as an officer, not as a man with anything left to protect or any reputation worth preserving. I deliver it as someone who saw what lives on the other side of the line I crossed, and I am telling you with the absolute certainty of personal experience that you do not want to see it for yourselves. Trade with humanity. Compete with them. Challenge their proposals in the conquered chambers. Race them to resource-rich worlds if you have the speed and the will. They will respect you for it. They will shake your hand afterward and buy you a drink and tell you stories about their children while they ask to hear stories about yours. They are, when you engage with them on fair and honest terms, among the most reasonable and most generous species in known space. But there is a line. It is not drawn on any star chart. It is not codified in any treaty. No human diplomat will ever mention it in negotiations because no human diplomat needs to. Every human being in existence knows where that line is, the way they know how to breathe, the way they know how to blink, the way they know how to flinch when something moves too fast near their face. The line is their children. Cross it and you will not be dealing with diplomats. You will not be dealing with soldiers. You will not be dealing with anything that negotiates or calculates or responds to threats or can be deterred or intimidated or worn down by attrition. You will be dealing with a parent, a teacher, a grandmother with a welding torch and hands that do not know how to stop. A dockworker with a grinding tool he knows will take 2 days to cut through your armor, kneeling on the hull of your station, and starting the job anyway because his grandchild is on the other side, and 2 days is not too long to wait. A woman alone in a shuttle too small for the journey she is making, crossing the space between stars with a worn stuffed bear on the seat beside her, because a 6-year-old boy cannot fall asleep without it, and that single fact has overridden every other consideration in the universe. For these people, there is no such thing as impossible. There is only the door between them and their child, and they will walk through anything, burn through anything, endure anything, sacrifice anything to open it. I was told that after the evacuation, after the last human vessel pulled away, and the station hung dark and empty in the silence, a maintenance crew conducting a structural damage assessment found something on the outer hull. During the long hours of cutting, someone had stopped their work long enough to paint words on the armored surface. Bright, crude, hand-painted letters applied directly to the scorched metal, visible from orbit. Nobody knew who had done it. Nobody had seen it happen. But there it was, written across the hull of a Telvari military installation in letters large enough to read from a passing ship. "We came for our children. Be grateful we left you yours." The tribunal has asked me for closing remarks. I will say this. If the situation had been reversed, if some other species had taken Telvari children from a Telvari colony, I do not believe my people would have done what the humans did. I believe we would have convened emergency sessions. I believe we would have activated diplomatic channels. I believe we would have calculated the costs and weighed the risks and assessed the probability of success and made the rational, measured, proportionate decision. And I believe that is exactly why we lost. Because the humans did not make a rational decision. They made the only decision their hearts would allow. And there is no strategy, no weapon, no fleet, no force anywhere in this galaxy or any other that can defeat a species that fights not with logic but with love. Not the gentle kind of love, not the kind that writes poetry and watches sunsets and speaks softly. The other kind, the old kind, the kind that burns hotter than the core of a star and endures longer than the lifespan of a galaxy. The kind that picks up a 5-year-old girl's red shoe from an empty playground and holds it against its chest, and goes quiet in a way that makes the air itself feel heavy with a promise that has not yet been spoken aloud, but that everyone present can feel in their bones. The kind that does not stop. The kind that does not yield. The kind that will cross the entire width of known space for a stuffed bear, because a child cannot sleep without it. That is what you should be afraid of. That is what I am afraid of. And that is what I will be afraid of until the day I close my eyes for the last time and go wherever old soldiers go when their wars are finished, and their warnings have been delivered, and there is nothing left to do but hope that somewhere, someone was listening. The tribunal may record my testimony as complete. I have nothing more to say.